previous video was a quick look over where Breitling has been and how they got to this point in being kind of dismissed and regarded as often irrelevant, certainly within the YouTube community. If you want to know more about my thoughts, go check out my previous video. But what I did is I took us up to now and had promised to speak about where Breitling was now and where they're planning to go, and in particular looking at through the lens of the things that George Kern has been saying about Breitling under his tenure as CEO. It's good in a sense being able to do this because George Kern loves being on the front foot. He loves talking to the media, and during this time of COVID-19 when there's not a lot of shows and everyone's looking for content, there's a lot of George Kern content out there. So this video is actually pretty easy to put together. All the materials out there if you're paying attention. So what's George been saying and what does that mean about the direction of Breitling? Before we get into the watches, I'm going to talk about the business side, because George has said at least as much about what he regards as the poor business practices of Breitling in the past as he has about the watches, possibly more. Some of his criticisms, the obvious ones were he felt the marketing was insane. I think that might have been his exact words, or ridiculous. I can't remember what it was. The whole macho, sexist, misogynist thing just appealed to a very small number of people, turned away vast numbers of people. In particular, historically, going back before bad Breitling, Breitling had actually been a very large seller of women's watches, and they had almost deliberately turned their back on that market, which is a dumb decision and one that George has said he's going to change. The other issue he said was most brands these days, 50%, I talk about this a lot in my videos, 50 to 55% of watches sold are sold in Asia. Breitling's footprint in Asia is approximately 10% of their watches. That reminds me, that's what he said was ridiculous. That is utterly insane. That's like, again, turning your back on the vast bulk of people who could buy your watches. Some of that was an ergonomic decision. They built these massive great watches that didn't suit smaller Asian wrists. Part of it was a marketing thing. Part of it was a distribution thing. Doesn't really matter. They have to go looking for that other half of the market that at the moment they're ignoring. The final thing that he was very critical of is that Breitling has had no or almost no control over the distribution of their own watches. This is classic 20th century / lazy management by Breitling. Previously, pre-internet world, pre-connected world, if you're a big OEM producing things that you sell globally, it's very difficult for you to deal with those remote customers and those remote sellers easily. So it was quite common for brands to establish third-party distributor arrangements. I'll sell the rights to sell my watches to some third-party organization. They will manage probably my watches and a whole bunch of other brands. They will have the direct relationships. All they'll do is they'll turn up to me, buy a bunch of watches, and I'll give it to them. 90% of brands have actually turned, in fact, not just in watches, across the board, that is a dying business model because it removes the manufacturer from the end customer. You don't really understand what's going on. You lose control of your brand, your marketing, your messaging, your sales, and it leaves you open to a whole bunch of things, such as dumping on the grey market, which is exactly what these distributors were doing. And I think that's where one of the biggest changes that you are going to see occurring. I think already, if I look at a lot of places which previously had watches at 60, 50% off, those things are reining back in. If you look at some of the other, it's funny, I've had some comments, people saying that they can see watches all over the place still at those massive markups. Frankly, I can't find them. So I'm not seeing some of the things you guys are reporting. What I am seeing are the older, no longer in catalog watches that have been dumped by previous generations. And I think that's perhaps what's confusing this a little bit. I'm being quite if you like, surgical in this analysis. I'm looking specifically at current catalogue, mostly released in the last year or two models. So that's all the business stuff out of the way. Now let's just talk about the actual catalogue. Okay, as I said earlier, Breitling, I think, sees themselves as a big player. They see themselves as a heavyweight that needs to have a full catalogue. There are smaller companies selling, 10, 20, 30, 50,000 watches a year that are happy to be pretty narrow. They don't worry about having a balanced catalogue. Panerai doesn't worry about having a balanced catalogue. They do what they do, and it's pretty narrow. I think, and they get away with that because they're in a group. What they don't cover is covered by other brands in that group. Breitling wanting to be independent, I'm not saying it competes with Rolex, but it's got that same relationship with the market as Rolex, and really has to cover a lot of bases. And so your catalogue has to be balanced. I think a well-balanced catalogue for one of these big organizations, really it's kind of like a perfume or a cologne, if that's a bit girly for you. It has base notes, it has mid notes, and it has high notes. In a perfume, the base notes are great big fat heavy molecules that can hang around forever. They evaporate very slowly, and they're there at the beginning but kind of hidden, but they're there for the long haul. Then you got the mid notes that they're there for most of it. You can usually smell them, you can rely on them being there most of the time, but they will change a bit more over time. Then you got the high notes. They're the ones that hit you as soon as you put it on. They last for a little bit, but then they vanish. That notion of base notes, mid notes, and high notes, I think applies beautifully to a well-balanced watch catalogue. It gives you that stability, that predictability, so that you've got these models that people know will be there year in, year out, decade in, decade out. If I want to buy a Navitimer and that is the watch I really want, knowing that 10 years, 20 years from now, that Navitimer will still be in the catalogue is actually really useful. The mid notes are watches which you can kind of rely on being there but will change. So this could be something like a Super Ocean, where the Super Ocean is always there but at the same time is always changing. If you look back through the Super Ocean catalogue, that brand, that family is always there, but it's constantly evolving just a little bit, keeping in contact with the times and the general feeling about what watches should look like. Then you got the high notes. These are your short limited runs. You pop in, you do something really popular, and then it vanishes away. The whole idea of the high note is not to shape the identity of your brand, it's to grab your attention and make you look so that you then see the rest of the brand. That's the purpose of the high note in perfume. That's the purpose of a limited or special edition in a watch catalogue. Now, if you look at what George Kearns has done and with the Breitling catalogue, and by the way, if you look at the Breitling catalogue from like 3 years ago and look at it today, there are there's the Navitimer, Heritage Diver, one or two others, but pretty much everything else has changed over. And so this is really how I see the Breitling catalogue. You've got the base notes, Navitimer, Aviation line, Premier line, and Super Ocean Heritage line. They're your base notes. You can rely on them being here for years, if not decades. Then you've got the mid-tone notes. So these are the lines which are always there, but are also evolving and changing to meet whatever is needed by the company at that time. So there you're looking at the Super Ocean line, the Adventure line, the Professional line, and the Chronomat, the recently released Chronomat, so re-released Chronomat. So those lines are constantly evolving. You can't guarantee that if you come back in 5 years, if you come back in 10 years time, there will be a Chronomat, but you can't be entirely sure that Chronomat will look like the Chronomat it was 10 years ago, unlike the heritage brands, the base notes that don't change much. Then you've got the high notes. Then you've got the special editions, the ones that pop in and pop back out again. The rainbow version of, and these could be special editions of either base notes or mid notes. So you've got the heritage, the recent Diver 57, I would call that a bass note, but then you have a high note version of that, the rainbow version, which by the way apparently sold out within minutes of being announced. And if you want one, if you didn't want one, Breitling doesn't care because they're all sold, and if you did want one, terribly sorry, they've all sold. If you look at the Brightlands Catalog, you see those categories, you see those notes, and you see that playing out. So that's what I think George Kern is aiming to do in the long run. Now, what's my personal opinion of that? I think I've made it pretty clear. I think it's a brilliant strategy. I think it's absolutely on the money. It gives you pretty much everything you want in a brand that you expect to be here for decades to come. A good solid base that you can build upon and rely upon year in, year out. Another above that, a layer which you can kind of rely on being there, but gives you flexibility to change and move and morph. And then above that, the ability to pop in, get something, get someone's attention, get something, and frankly, get some quick sales, and then pop back out again. I think that has a couple of advantages. It's a good catalog, gives your designers somewhere to go, gives you something new to talk about every year. It doesn't end up being moribund and kind of ossified like some other watch brands that have nothing but bass notes. And I think at the same time, it also gives you the ability to control your inventory a bit better. By having those different layers, you can have a big inventory of bass notes and you don't care. You just turn production on and off over time, but you know they're going to be there forever, so it doesn't really matter. Little bit more, you reduce your inventory a little bit more with the slightly more dynamic ranges in your mid notes, and then with your high notes you just make 500 of them, you sell them, and it's done. There's virtually no, that strategy really is really setting you up for a long-term look at getting rid of your grey market, or at least minimizing your grey market problem. There will always be a grey market. Like if I go to Joma Shop, there's a bunch of Rolexes. Don't tell me Rolex doesn't go to the grey market. It does. Most Rolexes are probably bought by consumers off the grey market. But what it does is it limits the problem you have in dealing with that grey market. So all in all, like I said, that's what I see George Kern is doing with Breitling as a sort of outside guy who deals with change and whatever. I would say it is happening extremely fast. He has turned over vast amounts of that organization in watch land, like at insane speeds. You know, he came in 2 years ago, virtually the entire catalog has been overturned. They've opened up, the entire marketing strategy has been overturned. Their relationship with consumers is changing. They've opened boutiques in a time when a lot of other brands are hardly moving at all. There's almost nothing the same at Breitling as there was 2 years ago. And I think to a lot of people from the outside, that has looked like chaos. I don't think it is. I think it's very calculated. I think that this is a change which, to be honest, I think they're kind of prepared to wear. I was going to say happy, but of course they're not happy. But I think they're prepared to wear some short-term pain to know that in 2030, Breitling will look completely different. Anyway, that's my take on this. I'm Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and my quick look at where I think Breitling is now and they're heading. Next, what I'm going to do is look at some of their new releases in the context of this discussion, what they're trying to do with their catalog and where they're heading. Anyway, thanks very much, and I'll see you later. Bye.